My name is James Lim from Stewardship Finance Academy. Today we are going to talk about petrol price. Just not long ago in 2020, traders were baffled by West Texas Intermediate WTI crude, the US benchmark oil price, which somehow flipped negative for the first time in history. In April 2020, futures for crude oil's US benchmark WTI went into negative territory, meaning for the first time in history, producers would pay traders to take oil off their hands. During the 2020 pandemic, globally, car manufacturing companies, factories, aeroplanes are reducing production. The demand for oil dropped drastically. Saudi Arabia told Russia to reduce production so that they can maintain the price. To show good faith, Saudi Arabia cut their own production substantially. But Saudi Arabia found that Russia was not cutting production. Instead, Russia was secretly increasing production and reducing the oil price substantially. Saudi Arabia responded by undercutting oil prices by $6 to $7 per barrel by increasing the supply until Russia couldn't stand that low price due to their production costs. Saudi and Russia finally settled their differences.
That would be a great opportunity to invest in oil then.
Yeah, exactly. Because just 2 years later, the price of Brent crude, a global benchmark, soared up past $124 a barrel. Some countries benefit from having oil as a cheaper input, but Russia is not one of them. Russia is the second largest exporter of oil, selling around 10 million barrels per day in global markets, which equates to about 45% of Russia's budget revenues. Amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the inflation-adjusted price of oil reached a 7-year high. Russia is one of the world's largest producers of crude oil, and many countries have announced a ban on Russia's oil imports amid the war. So this has led to supply uncertainties and therefore rising prices.
Why is the oil price so volatile?
The oil prices have been volatile mainly because the supply and demand of oil tends to have low responsiveness to price changes in the short term. Like on the supply side, oil production capacity can be challenging to change quickly. Drilling a new oil well is a lengthy and complex process. And on the demand side, it can be quite difficult to change equipment that uses petroleum products. For instance, in the short term, people will keep driving their cars to work despite the higher gas prices. So for these reasons, in order to rebalance supply and demand, it takes a sufficiently large price change to occur. For example, if gas prices were to double, only then maybe enough commuters consider taking public transit or changing their behavior in other ways.
Talking about the gas prices for vehicles, the cost of gas has been a hot topic of conversation lately as prices reach record-breaking highs.
Yes. So before we move on, do you know why petrol is called gas in some countries of the world, even when it is in liquid form in automobiles?
Not really.
So actually both gasoline and petrol are referring to the fuel for passenger vehicles. In the US and Latin countries, the term gasoline is used, and gas is actually short for gasoline. But in Europe and Asian countries, it is called petrol. In July 2022, the average price of gasoline around the world is $1.47 per liter. As a general rule, richer countries have higher prices while poorer countries and the countries that produce and export oil have significantly lower prices. According to the global petrolprices.com, Venezuela has the cheapest price, just 2 cents per liter, followed by Libya, 3 cents per liter, and Iran, 5 cents per liter. Among the top 10 cheapest, 5 countries are located in Asia, 4 in Africa, and 1 in South America. Hong Kong has the most expensive price of $3.03, followed by Norway. Lack of local oil refinery facilities in Hong Kong is one of the main factors contributing to the high cost. All auto fuel products sold in Hong Kong are imported as refined products, not crude oil. Though Norway have oil reserves, they don't subsidize fuels and use the money for free college education and national infrastructures. The United States, though, accounts for about 40% of the world's gasoline consumption, is only paying half of the average price in the European Union.
And why such a huge difference despite the high crude oil prices?
It turned out that crude oil's price is only one of the main factors affecting the gasoline prices. The differences in prices across countries are also due to the various taxes and subsidies for gasoline. All countries have access to the same petroleum prices of international markets, but then decide to impose different taxes. According to US Energy Information Administration, there are 4 main factors that influence the price of gasoline. Number 1, crude oil prices. Number 2, refining costs. Number 3, taxes. And number 4, distribution and marketing costs. Let's look at the crude oil price. The most influential factor is the cost of crude oil, which is largely dictated by the international supply and demand, especially if your country is an oil importer like US. Despite being the world's largest oil producer, the US remains a net importer of crude oil, with the majority coming from Canada, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. Because of America's reliance on imports, US gas prices are largely influenced by the global crude oil market. A number of geopolitical factors can influence the crude oil market, but one of the biggest influences is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or we call them OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia. In 1959, the first Arab Petroleum Congress was held in Egypt. During the Congress, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela say that we can no longer be bullied by the US and let them decide on the oil price. We need to stand out and fight. Right? So the oil ministers of the 2 countries call on other oil-producing countries in the Middle East to set out an oil advisory committee to audit the multinational oil companies and the oil price change. During that time, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela were the 2 largest oil-producing nations other than the US and the former Soviet. Later in September 1960, representatives from Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela gathered in Baghdad to discuss how to join forces to raise oil prices and get rid of the control of oil by Western countries. So these 5 countries together account for nearly 60% of the world's known oil reserves. Especially Kuwait, a small country with just over 4 million population, owns 6.1% of the world's oil. So together, they form OPEC. From 1961 to 1975, members of OPEC grew from 5 to 13. The oil production of all these members countries could account for more than half of the world's oil production at that time. That gives them the ability to influence the market. OPEC can set oil production targets for its 13 members countries to control the supply of the oil in the global market. Today, OPEC countries are responsible for about 60% of the internationally traded petroleum. Then we have refining costs. Even if more oil was flowing into the country and tankers full of Russian crude oil were brought in, oil still needs to be refined into gasoline before it can be used by consumers, which is why refining costs are factored into the price of gas. The exact cost of refining varies depending on a number of factors such as the type of crude oil used, the processing technology available at the refinery, and the gasoline requirements in specific parts of the country. So in general, refining capacity in many countries like US has not been keeping up with the oil demand. Several refineries shut down throughout the pandemic, but even before COVID-19, refining capacity in the US was lagging behind demand. Incredibly, there haven't been any brand new refinery facilities built in the country since 1977. Tax also play a critical role in determining the price of gas. Some countries tax fuel so heavily that almost half of the price you pay at the pump actually goes towards paying for the fuel itself. In the UK, for example, fuel is taxed twice, attracting the fuel duty and then having 20% value-added tax. It's a kind of sales tax. So VAT is charged on top of the combined price of the fuel and the fuel duty, meaning the government actually makes more money when the price of crude goes up. Some other countries hardly levy any taxes at all. So the chart here shows from the US Department of Energy's Alternative Fuels Data Center. Though it's a couple of years old, but it helps us to get an idea of the wildly different fuels taxation strategies employed around the world. From the graph, we can see the most driver-friendly nations are Indonesia, Brazil, United States, and Canada. UK drivers hand their government $3.49 every time they drop a gallon of gasoline into their tanks, compared to Indonesians who are charged just 11 cents as tax. In Australia, it is $1.14 tax per gallon.
There's quite a difference across the countries.
Yes. Another interesting thing to note from the graph is how differently some countries treat gasoline and diesel. While the UK, Switzerland, and Indonesia apply almost the same tax to diesel as they do to petrol, some countries tax diesel at a much lower rate. In Greece, for instance, gasoline is taxed as $2.93 per gallon, but diesel only attracts a $1.40 levy. And in Chile, the government applies only 39 cent levy on diesel, but a $1.59 charge on gasoline. So the odd man out in this case are Iceland, Mexico, and US, where diesel is hit with a higher taxes than gasoline. So if you really hate being taxed on your fuel, then you can move to Brazil and buy a diesel car. Distribution and marketing costs. Lastly, the cost of distribution and marketing have an impact on the price of gas. Gasoline is typically shipped from refineries to local terminals via pipelines. From there, the gasoline is processed further to ensure it meets market requirements or local government standards. Pipelines are the primary method of transporting crude oils around the world, delivering oil and its derivative products safely to the refineries and empowering reliance businesses. Gas stations then distribute the final product to the consumer. The cost of running a gas station varies. Some gas stations are owned and operated by the brand name refineries like Chevron, while others are smaller scale operations owned by independent merchants. It is important to note that pipelines are not a perfect solution, as leaks and spills in just the last decade have resulted in billions of dollars of damages. From 2010 to 2020, US Department of Transportation recorded 983 incidents that resulted in 149,000 spilled and uncovered barrels of oil, 5 fatalities, 27 injuries, and more than 2.5 billion in damages. And in terms of marketing, the big name brands runs a lot of advertisements. According to Morning Consult, Chevron, BP plc, ExxonMobil Corp, and Royal Dutch Shell plc air TV advertisements in the US more than 44,495 times between 1st June 2020 and 31st August 2021. So these are the 4 main factors contributing to the petrol price. By the way, as Ukraine-Russia war is blamed for the expensive petrol price, do you know how much of US oils come from Russia? Only 8%. In the US, oil imports only count for about 20% of the US supply, and majority of them come from Canada. How about Australia? Only 1.2% from Russia. In most European countries, that number is much higher. Australia is almost entirely reliant on overseas imports for its fuel. Australians get most of the fuel from Asia, with around a quarter of it coming from Singapore. Some people are wondering, since many countries like US and Australia do not really buy oil from Russia, the war in Europe shouldn't really have a massive knock-on effect on our petrol price. Why is a Russia-Ukraine conflict impacting prices in the whole world? What the hell is going on, and why can't we afford to drive anywhere anymore? Right? This is because oil is bought and sold on the global commodities market. So when countries impose sanctions on Russian oil, that put a squeeze on global supply, which ultimately drove up prices. Unless your country has enough domestic supply of fuel, according to Australian petroleum statistics, Australians only have about 22 days of diesel and 31 days of petrol if supply stopped coming in. So we have seen a steady increase in prices over the past few years after the global fuel costs crashed during the pandemic. While Ukraine-Russia conflict is certainly a factor, it's not the only things that are driving it. The global wake-up after the pandemic, in which many people are commuting again, global shipping and transport has resumed, that led to an increase in demand, driving the fuel prices higher. While fuel prices have climbed in response to the European conflict, they are more market-driven than supply-based. The global economy had anticipated a shortfall in fuel production, increasing demand before the US, the UK, and Australia placed a ban on Russian oil. The actual sanctioning on Russia now in effect is likely to send global prices even higher as those countries seek to get their fuel from elsewhere. It's also worth noting that even as the price of oil begins to fall once again, there is typically a lag behind prices as the pump begins to ease for consumer. The Energy Information Administration projects that average spot price of Brent crude oil would be $105.22 per barrel this year. So as a result, many experts are expecting that gas prices will stay high for the rest of the year.
So what can we do about it?
Well, we could produce more to cover the Russia shortfall, but as mentioned just now, that takes time and it is not something many countries are in a position to do without opening a new oil fields. Internationally, the production of oil is controlled by OPEC. The cartel generally tries to keep prices as tolerably high as possible. Increasing production is not economically attractive to them, and again, will likely take longer for them to do that than the current upset will last. Others suggest cutting the tax paid on fuels, but government argues that doing so will reduce the amount we pay on gasoline in the short term and increase the amount that we spend in other areas of the economy. Ultimately, there is little the average consumer can do to avoid the high cost of fuel. In the short term, it's best to use fuel tracking apps like Petrol, which will tell you where the cheapest fuel is in your local area, as well as cutting down on journeys as much as possible. Trying to time the petrol price cycle is another good way of ensuring that you get the best price.
Well, I think cycling is also a good option if you live close enough to work to make this viable.
Yes, and it is healthy too. In the long run, you can look to make your next vehicle an electric one. That means being free from the constant worry about increasing petrol prices. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. Our channel seeks to provide insights on recent economic and market trends. Please like our video. That will give us tremendous encouragement to do better and generate more content. Remember to subscribe to our channel to stay educated. See you in the next video.